Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCK Week 3 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. It's an incredibly fun week in the LCK. We're really getting into the thick of things here in the spring split. The teams at the top are really starting to separate themselves. The teams at the bottom are really starting to separate themselves. We're getting a good idea as to where everybody kind of falls in the landscape of the LCK. Who's going to contend, who's going to overperform, who's not going to contend, who's going to underperform, and that is a lot of fun. So moving in here to week 3, a lot of fun games to cover. Let me know down in the comment section below which one you were the most excited about or which one you enjoyed the most in week number 3 here in the LCK. You know I love to hear you guys' feedback, thoughts, and opinions. Who's impressing you? Who's not impressing you? I'd love to hear you guys' feelings down in the comment section below, but let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into our action. If you are new here, we cover all 10 LCK series in week number 3 in this video, going over the strengths, the weaknesses, the ups and the downs of every team in the league in both of their series of the week. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go game by game, starting of course with day number 1. And we kicked off day number 1 with the matchup between NS RedForce and Liiv SANDBOX. Two teams that are kind of in opposite directions. Two teams that I actually saw as relatively similar in the same tier in my preseason power rankings before the spring split started. But as we look at them now, clearly they are going in very different directions. Liiv SANDBOX is able to pick up the 2-0 win, I believe. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is their first 2-0 win all year long. This is a team that has grinded out 3-game series pretty much all year against pretty much everyone they've faced. But they've looked good doing it. They go to 4-1 now on the year. A fantastic start for a team that lost a lot of talent in the offseason. People were really concerned with how this roster was going to continue on from last year. Really, it's just Kale of the big 3 that they had last year in Croco, Prince, and Kale that kind of led them almost to Worlds throughout most of 2022. But honestly, this organization did what it always does. It retools, it goes with some, I want to say more unproven, just comparatively to what they had last year, some more unproven players in a lot of these positions, and they end up making it work, because that's just what SANDBOX does. That's what they've done historically every single year in the LCK, even back to their first year. I believe they came up the same year as Damwon, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe they came up into the LCK same year as Damwon, and Damwon was this big hype team with a lot of really good young players, and SANDBOX was like, oh, well, they're the one that are going to, you know, kind of disappoint, but both of them make top 6. Obviously, Damwon's really good, but SANDBOX is also really good, blowing past any expectations people had for them. And then they have that Summit Fate team that is much better than people give them credit for. Summit, you know, drags that team to top 6 at the time, you know, etc., etc. Then you have last year where Prince almost gets them to Worlds. You have this year where it feels like they're also just overperforming expectations. Every single year, it just feels like this team takes what people think they're going to do and turns it on its head and continues to look a lot better than people expect. And it's because this organization knows how to get the most out of underutilized talent. But in this series in particular, we had a lot of really good storylines for Liiv SANDBOX. They were the better team, I would say, in both games. Game 1 was relatively slow, but it was a really good slow performance. They had complete map control, and just because they weren't taking fights doesn't mean that they weren't actively exerting that pressure on NS, really making it difficult for them to have to play the game really at all. But it was Game 2 where they looked incredibly dominant. They were winning lanes. They were making a lot of aggressive plays towards the back half of the game. And a lot of that, in my opinion, is the difference between a fed closer and a not fed closer. That really seems to be the mentality difference for Liiv SANDBOX. When closer is super fed, this team is super willing to fight. I think his closer as a player is incredibly aggressive and incredibly willing to fight in a lot of these situations when he is ahead, like he was on the Sylas in Game 2, which we'll talk about. But in Game number 1 on the Jace, he was just kind of there. Like, he wasn't behind by any means. He certainly was winning, but he wasn't like super far ahead to the point where he could take a lot of these 1v2 fights, or that they really wanted to take a lot of these 2v2, 3v3 skirmishes all the time. And so they ended up playing it a lot slower. It seems like everybody else on the team is a little bit more controlled. Willer in particular, I think, wants to go for more of these late game plays rather than closer, who I think when he's ahead does like the skirmish. And I think that's kind of the difference that we saw in these 2 games. And so a lot of good players from Liiv SANDBOX. For me, player of the series is going to go to Kale in the support position. he continues to be phenomenal. He was incredibly underrated last year for me on Liiv SANDBOX. Him and Prince had a ridiculously good bot lane synergy together, especially in the 2v2. That was the big reason why Liiv SANDBOX, in my opinion, was so difficult to beat in the regular season in particular, because that bot lane would almost never lose lane. They would be up 10, 15, 20 CS every single game. It didn't matter who they were playing against, even against some of the best teams in the entire league. That organization, that team would consistently be able to win in the bot lane. Kaele's pressure that he exudes early on in laning phase is almost unmatched, and he does a great job being able to move that pressure around the map once we start to get closer towards that mid game. It's just the first 4 to 5 levels that I think Kaele is one of the best supports in the world at, and he has continued on with that in this year, in my opinion. Another really good game of Heimerdinger in game number 1, where it really felt like he was controlling the tempo of that game. He was allowing Liiv SANDBOX to be basically wherever they wanted to be, as long as they had the time and the resources to set up, and Nongshim just couldn't step up and actually do anything to him. And then game number 2, the Caitlyn Lux was super devastating in the bot lane 2v2. They were able to generate such a huge lead, and the Lux was able to move all around the map, create advantages for Willer in particular in the jungle, but also Closer in the mid lane on that Akali, because it's very difficult for that Akali to actively generate anything in the mid lane if you've got a Lux consistently roaming and your Karma just can't match because the Jhin is so far behind. Also, shout out 2 games of Jhin. Not a good look from Nongshim. Never something you really want to see at a pro level is back-to-back games of Jhin, especially into Caitlyn, in my opinion. But credit to the Liiv SANDBOX bot lane. This is something that I was really worried about going into the year. Clearly, it is not a problem. Kaele has always been very good, and I was very complimentary of him in my preseason player rankings video, but Envy is someone who I did not expect to keep up. It turns out that both of them also work well together, and that Kaele definitely earned his spot in the LCK here. And Envy, you know, for as bad as he was last year, has certainly turned a new corner in 2023. But the other player I was really considering for player of the series here was Willer in the jungle, who had such a phenomenal game number 2 here on the Sejuani. The reason I gave it to Kaele over Willer, I thought Willer was more impactful in game number 2 in terms of being able to generate a lot of the advantages that SANDBOX was able to create in that one, but I feel like Kaele was super impactful in both games, whereas Willer, you know, game number 1 was fine, just he didn't necessarily make any gigantic plays quite like Kaele did on the Heimerdinger, and so for me, Kaele's going to get player of the series, but Willer continues to way overperform any expectations people had for him. Of course, he has shown potential in the LCK in the past on Hanwha, but for someone who was benched the entire year for who was probably the worst jungler in the league last year and on Fleek, I didn't really think that a lot of orgs in the LCK specifically saw him as an actual threat, but he finally gets more stage time here on a good organization in SANDBOX, and he's actually able to make the most of it, so really impressed with him. And then, of course, on the side of Nongshim, it's just kind of who they are. They're just a team that isn't particularly good compared to a lot of the other actually good teams in the league. They're very young, they have talent, but they certainly don't have the consistency and they don't have the cohesion to put it together. My dud of the series here is going to go to Fiesta in the mid lane. I still think that he is probably the hypest prospect on this team. I think Sylvie and Peter are also right there with him, but for me, Fiesta is still the one that I look out for the most. He just got obliterated in this game number 2. A really bad Akali game from him. It's going to happen. Sometimes when you take these more, I would say aggressive, more volatile matchups in the mid lane, things like Akali into Sylas, things that very much can go wrong if they start to go wrong, you're going to see some scorelines that aren't as good, and that's unfortunately what happened to him. He also had a lot of the burden to carry a lot of these games. Din Din in the top lane had to go into Fiora, and he was consistently behind on the Jax, and then Vital picked Jhin 2 games in a row, and so a lot of pressure was being put on the damage output from this mid laner, and I think Liiv SANDBOX knew that as well, and they spent a lot of resources, a lot of time making sure that Fiesta wasn't going to be able to play a lot of this series. I think overall, there is some good that Nongshim has shown over the past few weeks, but they're just too young. They're not there yet. The overall consistency is just not entirely there. I think Vital has not really been all that good in the LCK so far this year. I think Din Din has been almost nothing in the top lane. I do think Sylvie and Fiesta have been able to win them some games, and we know that Peter has been a good force in the LCK in the past, but right now it just doesn't seem like they are going to be a team that can compete on the same level as any of the teams that are really fighting for top 6. A team like Liiv SANDBOX or a team like KT Rolster or anybody kind of in that zone, it doesn't feel like they're quite on that level. I also don't think they're complete pushovers either, though. I just think at this series, they were just a tad bit outmatched. But that's a good thing for SANDBOX. It just kind of shows you where they really are. This is not a team that is in the same tier as a team like Nongshim, who I have at number 8. This is a team that absolutely deserves to be in that top 5, top 6 teams in the LCK right now, because they really are firing on all cylinders. They are better than I was ever expecting them to be, and you got to be incredibly happy if you're a SANDBOX fan. You continue to overperform your expectations year after year after year, almost irrelevant of the talent that you have on the team. You're able to get the most out of it. Players like Closer are really coming out of their shell. Willer really coming out of their shell in 2023. You really just hope that they're going to be able to keep it up throughout the rest of the year. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1. We had two teams that are relatively at the top of the standings going head-to-head as we saw Gen.G taking on Dplus KIA. And Gen.G picking up a huge 2-0 win against Dplus. It felt like the top two were really untouchable going into the year. It felt like they were kind of on a planet of their own, especially with how the season started, how close that series was last week in week number 2. It felt like T1, DK, right on that same level on the upper echelon, but Gen.G said, no, we are inserting ourselves right in the middle of that conversation by taking down Dplus KIA here. An absolutely ginormous win for them, and honestly, they were significantly better in both games. They were just the better team in this series, and that is the incredibly impressive part to me. I know I've gotten a lot of comments about how I've been ranking Gen.G just a tad bit too high. Some of these players, I know a lot of online analysts in particular don't have nearly as high as I do. I know I got a lot of flack for putting Peanut as my #1 jungler in the LCK heading into 2023, but I think this series does kind of give a lot of credence to some of the points that I was making over the course of the offseason and why I felt this team was good enough to be able to keep up with a lot of the rest of the teams at the top of the LCK. So let's go ahead and talk about what they ended up doing right. Well, game number 1 was really off of the back of Chovy just getting so strong towards the back half of that game. Obviously, we know what Chovy can do on this channel. It's certainly not a surprise to a lot of people that he was able to dominate in the team fights quite like he was, because we've watched him do that for over a year. I know consistently Reddit is surprised that Chovy is able to team fight for some reason. They seem to see him as just a player who's really good in lane and does nothing else and, you know, is overrated and blah, 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 blah. I think obviously we on the channel have known for long enough that Chovy is definitely able to perform in every facet of the game and actively does lead his team to a lot of wins, and I think that happened in game 1, but you do have to give a lot of credit to Peanut on this Wukong as well for a lot of those initiations. They have a very beefy frontline in game number 1 on the side of Dplus KIA. It was going to take a lot to get through that, and I think the Wukong did a really good job of keeping frontline distracted, even if they weren't always in the right position, of keeping frontline distracted so Akali could blow up the Sivir and really make a lot of these fights easier on the side of Gen.G. So credit to Peanut and Chovy. I thought they were really dominant as a duo in game number 1. And then game number 2, God, it was just Peanut controlling every single facet of the game. It was so ridiculously impressive. Peanut is actually going to get my player of the series. I don't think that's really going to shock anybody who watched the games. He was just in so much control of not only the map, but just the entire game state that it was astounding in game number 2. One of the best jungle performances in the LCK this year coming out from Peanut against Canyon in game number 2. Someone who obviously Peanut got a lot of flack for really not performing fantastic against at the World Championships, even in Gen.G's win last year. So he gets his Vi, a pick that he has been fantastic on over the past year. I usually talk about Vi as a champion that I don't recommend a lot of players pick, but Peanut has proven over and over and over again that he is fantastic on the champion. I'm willing to obviously just give him the whenever pass. He can pick this champion whenever he wants. This and Poppy for Peanut are just like no-brainers. Like, yeah, go ahead, pick him. Sure, yes, 100%. But he's able to control the early game, be able to generate a pretty big lead for Gen.G, and then just kind of scale that into the late game. A lot of his lanes won. Chovy did a really good job in his Showmaker. Not nearly as good as he did into game 1, but still a pretty good job, in my opinion, on the LeBlanc. Doran just beat Kana in both sides of the Narc-Asante matchup, which was incredibly impressive. And the other player that I really, really want to shout out, I know Peanut's player of the series, but the other player that I really do want to give a big shout out to is Delight in the support position. This is somebody who I was actually really concerned about going into the year. If there was a big reason why I thought Gen.G might underperform the expectations I was giving them, it was because Delight was not really a top tier support, in my opinion. I thought he was really overmatched coming in here and playing for Gen.G comparatively to a lot of the rest of the talent on this team from what we had seen from him in the LCK up until this point in his career, but he has been very good for this team. I mean, him and Pez have very good synergy. It's mostly been Pez kind of dominating a lot of these late game team fights, but in this series, it was Delight. This is easily his best series in a Gen.G uniform, and if you can keep this up, I mean, this team is terrifying. Like, this is the kind of performance you needed out of him in order for you to beat Dplus KIA, and so incredibly impressive. Pez went 12-1-12 and was honestly the least important member of Gen.G in this series. That kind of tells you how good this team played and how fantastic. They're kind of rolling right now. As for Dplus KIA, some concerns. You're starting to get a little bit concerned. This is 2 losses in a row. Again, it's to T1 and Gen.G, so you don't want to hit the panic button or anything like that. You're obviously still a very good team, and that loss to T1 was incredibly close. But it is worth noting, Showmaker in the mid lane, someone who you rely a lot on in terms of pressure for Canyon to be able to do what he likes to do, for Deft to be able to play that more passive early game, late game carry style that he gets used to, you know, on things like the Sivir. Showmaker's really got to perform in the early to mid game, and he has really struggled with that this year. This is another dud of the series for him. He has struggled I would honestly say 3 years, but mostly 2 years in a row now to start the season. He's been someone who I think ramps up over the course of the season as games get a little bit more I don't know, predictable as they settle in a tad bit more. I think Showmaker gets a little bit more comfortable playing, but he's having another start of season slump here for DK, and it's concerning. Chovy outplayed him by a considerable margin in this game, and that's not particularly surprising. Chovy's a fantastic player and should be better than Showmaker, you know, comparatively to what they were last year, but I think Showmaker struggling as hard as he did, most specifically in game number 1, was really the big problem for Dplus. I think if they had a Swain that was able to contribute a lot of damage in these team fights, was able to maybe help peel for the Sivir, just cause any sort of distraction, anything like that, I do think that game 1 becomes more difficult for Gen.G to win towards the back half. Deft has a lot more time to actually try and fight these, but Showmaker is just so out of position all the time. He gets destroyed in game number 2 as well on the Silas. It's just a very disappointing performance. If he continues to play like this, Dplus might underperform expectations. This team really has no reason not to be top 2. They've kind of been that all year long. Showmaker's really not been in top 2 form as we've started the season. He definitely, obviously, has the potential to get there. In my opinion, Canyon and Showmaker are the greatest jungle mid duo of all time, but he's not there right now. He really just isn't. It's another poor performance from Showmaker, and he's just got to get back on track. Canyon was out jungled by Peanut, specifically in game number 2. I'm not going to blame it entirely on him. His lanes lost, Kana lost, Showmaker lost. Deft and Kellen were relatively even, but for the most part, that's just what Deft does, right? He didn't really have a lane that he could go to and force the issue with, and so, you know, I'm not going to blame him entirely, but mostly this was the solo laners on the side of Dplus not really performing. So, outlook-wise for Dplus, I'm not going to be concerned, but this is a frustrating loss. You certainly wanted this to be a win. You certainly wanted to look down a good team like Gen.G and prove that you are a tier above them, but all that you proved here was that you have a lot of things that you need to fix. Showmaker needs to get back on track. Kana might not be this big upgrade in the top lane that we were all kind of hoping he would be so far as the season has started. He was really good through the first 2 weeks, but running into Doran here, it's really looking like Doran has a little bit more stability up on that top side. And for as good as Deft and Kellen have been in terms of being able to carry the late game and just win Dplus games towards the back half, their flaws, or Deft's flaws in particular from DRX, are definitely still here, where he's not the most aggressive in the early game. As for Gen.G, I mean, this is fantastic. You could not ask for a better series than this. Peanut and Chovy look unstoppable as a jungle mid duo. I think a lot of people would still make the case that they are one of, if not the best jungle mid duo in the world, right up there with Kanavi and Knight, in my opinion. And I think that's great. I certainly don't see any reason to not believe that. Delight played fantastic in the series. Doran looked really good. Pez has been fantastic up till this point this year. Gen.G really proved, in my opinion, in this series in particular, that they deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as some of the top dogs, and hopefully they can keep that up as we go throughout spring. Moving on to our second day of games here in Week 3, we kicked it off with another battle that I think a lot of people just wanted to see some level of competitiveness in. We had BRION taking on DRX. Two teams, one that I think is overperforming a tad bit, the other that is completely shit the bed, completely out of there in DRX. And it kind of continues here. Bro picks up the 2-1 series win. DRX continues to not look like they're able to compete with a lot of the teams at this level, even the ones that really aren't playoff caliber like Bro, in my opinion. And honestly, I don't really know what else there is to do when it comes to DRX. I really don't know what else that you could possibly do to kind of salvage this roster, but we'll get to that in a bit because it's kind of just playing out in the worst case scenario that was realistic for DRX. There's not a ton of like, oh, surprise. Like this is just like, oh, everything's gone wrong. So for Bro, everything's kind of going right. I actually really do like this team, and I think they're playing at the highest level that they have played at individually in a very long time in terms of a lot of these players, and that most specifically applies to the bot lane here with Hanwha and Effort, who have actually been very complimentary of over the course of the start of this season, and that's going to continue in this series. Hanwha is going to get my player of the series here for Bro. Him and Effort continue to actually look pretty solid, which is certainly not what I expected going into the year. Effort might have just been the single worst player in a major region last year, and Hanwha had certainly never proven anything at this level before. And so going into this year, I just assumed they were going to be one of the more uninteresting bot lanes in the LCK. I thought they were going to just kind of get a little bit stomped by a lot of the better teams in the league, but I've been completely wrong. They've actually been really good, and they've been able to hold their own against some good bot lanes. Of course, that's not what DRX has right now, but it is worth noting that Hanwha and Effort, definitely kind of fun to watch, and a lot more competitive than I think a lot of people are going to give them credit for. Hanwha, in particular, was fantastic in both games 1 and 3 here. Most specifically in game 1, where he just completely popped off on the Zeri, but even in game 3, he was dominating in lane, which is just really not how this lane should happen. Effort playing the Nautilus with the Zeri is something that is incredibly rare, but it actually worked really well because of Beryl. Shout out, we'll get to him in a second, but you know, when you can land those hooks on a target and get those free picks on a support Twitch, you're going to look pretty good doing it, and I think Hanwha looked really, really solid, and Effort looked really, really solid in this series. The bot lane continues to improve. Karis is the other member here of Bro that I really do want to point out as someone who I think is over-exceeding expectations. I don't think he's been particularly, godlike over the first couple of weeks or anything. I would say that Hanwha, and Effort have been the 3 best players on Bro. Karis, honestly, in my opinion, probably the least important member through the first 5 games, but for a team that has been relatively competent, even against some of the more interesting teams in the league, I think Karis just being fine and not necessarily a problem is a good thing for this team overall. So much so that I think his contribution to this series in particular was really high. That Kassadin game in game number 3, really, really good. He went into Fate and he was honestly just better. He was actually able to generate a small little lead so that when he got to that level 11 towards the back half of that game, eventually obviously to the level 16, he was so incredibly strong. I think we see this a lot with Rise matchups, just in general, where if you're not super far ahead and if you're not in a position to win the game towards the back half and split push and team fight and create all this macro pressure, Rise is generally useless as a pick. I don't want to say that Rise is a little bit of a bait right now, but I think especially in terms of bad teams, Rise is a little bit bait right now. I think you do need to be very talented in order to pilot Rise at a high level, and I just don't think that was happening in this series. I think we kind of saw what happened when you just pick a very easy to execute champion into Rise, who is a very difficult to execute champion at this level, in my opinion, and Karis looked very good doing it. So the 2 carry roles honestly really showing up for Bro, and that's awesome. I think He's had a great start to the year. He's kind of solidified his spot as the starting jungler. Morgan continues to be the exact same thing that he's been for a while up in the top lane. And then, like I said, Hanwha and Effort really doing a great job of being able to kind of push forward, especially early on in games and in laning phases, to be able to create advantages for Bro. As for DRX, not as good of a start to the year. I think going 1-4 with a roster like this, especially coming off of a world championship, is not particularly how I think this organization wanted to start 2023. There are positives, and his name is Rascal. He continues to be fantastic up in the top lane. This is very similar to Spring Split Rascal last year in 2022, where it felt like nobody else on KT was actually performing early on in that Spring Split. I know we talk about aiming and Life having a really good 2022, and they absolutely did, but we have to remember most of that was Summer Split. I think in Spring Split, they were still trying to get acclimated together. They were still having their problems. Aria was in the mid lane, and it seriously was not working out there. Cuz was really bad in Spring, and Rascal was kind of on his own. Feels very similar here on DRX, where it's like Rascal having a great game number 1, in particular on this Jax, having a really good game number 2, along with Fate on the Sylas, and then, you know, being okay in game number 3. Nobody really did well in game number 3, in my opinion, on DRX, but for Rascal, you just hope that he's able to keep this form up. I know the rest of the team isn't performing, but if you can get good performances out of like 1 or 2 other members on this team, you're probably going to be able to win some games. We saw them win game number 2 basically just off the fact that the 2 solo laners looked good. Rascal played really well, and Fate had a very good game number 2, in particular on the Sylas. Now, we can talk about his game 1 on the Jason, game 3 on the Rise, where both of those were pretty horrendous performances, but Rascal looked really good all 3 games, and if he can keep that up, you really don't need a ton else to go right for DRX in order for them to actually be a team that can compete with that can beat Bro. Rascal's already kind of there. I think you just need another player on the team to step up. In game 2, that was Fate. In games 1 and 3, that was no one, and so that's kind of unfortunate for them. We got to talk about this bot lane, though. I honestly want to start this by saying I understand that Reddit, one of the players, I kind of talked about this in my LPL video if you watched that. Reddit kind of finds players that they hate and kind of attach themselves to and just kind of push down. I understand why Reddit is looking at Dectum as the biggest problem on DRX, but it is just really hard for me to see Dectum as the biggest problem here on DRX, especially when he has to play with Beryl right now, who is playing at such a criminally low level that I'm not sure anybody could play bot lane with Beryl and look good, whether that's Deft, whether that's Viper, whether that's Ruler. I don't think anybody in the world could play with Beryl right now and look great. I think, you know, obviously some people could make him look better, and Dectum's certainly not making it better, but Beryl has been so atrocious to start this year, and I hate to say it, but you go back and watch my player rankings in my preseason preview for the LCK, I'm not particularly surprised. This is something that I actually predicted in my preseason overview for the LCK, that Beryl was, of all the players to keep, probably the riskiest one. Because you look back on his 2022 as a whole, and you realize, oh, he was kind of bad for a lot of the regular season. He ended up turning it on in the playoffs, and he was good at Worlds. He certainly still had some bad performances at Worlds, but for the most part, he was positive at Worlds. But he would have games like this, where it's just like, dude, why are you walking up to get Vision down 6k gold and just dying? Like, what exactly is the purpose of any of the plays that you're making? Beryl made a lot of those last year, along with Pioshik, and it really did cost DRX. There's a reason that team went 500 in the regular season, even though players like Zeka and Deft were actually playing relatively well. It's because Beryl and Pioshik, to a smaller extent, were just really bad for DRX in the regular season, and that has kind of carried over. Beryl was a huge problem in the series, easy choice for dud of the series, in my opinion. It's not just him. Obviously, Dectum is playing poor, but there's only so much you can do sometimes as an AD carry when your support is quite literally running it, like completely running it, when you are essentially 1v2 in lane. So I understand that, you know, Reddit wants to look at Dectum as like the biggest problem for DRX, but Beryl to me has been significantly worse, and I think it's been significantly more problematic for DRX. I think Dectum, you know, is still capable of playing at a relatively good level in the LCK. I just don't know if him and Beryl are going to be able to do it together here in 2023. Krako's been bad. Fate's had some good performances. He looked really good on the Silas, but I mean, he's just super inconsistent. He was really bad through the first couple of weeks, and he's kind of gotten better as the year has gone on, but he still has some of these not-so-good performances, in my opinion. DRX just seems to not have any sort of life in them. It feels like Beryl completely runs the game away, and then DRX just kind of rolls over and dies. Rascal tries his best to win up on the top side, and he'll gain his advantages, and he'll look better in the top lane, but none of it will matter because the rest of the team is losing. Like, the feeling of hopelessness, I think, surrounding this DRX team is just insane right now, and I really don't know what you can do to pull yourself out of that. You have to have some major upset, but I just don't know what team is going to fall to them in order to make that happen. For Bro, though, you continue to look like the team that you have looked like over the first couple of weeks. You started 5-5, 2-2. You continue to look like that number 7-ish team in the power rankings here. A team that is able to take advantage of a lot of these teams that are really struggling in terms of consistency, in terms of being able to adapt. Right now, a team like DRX, you're able to take advantage of that, but not necessarily a team that's going to be pressuring, you know, KT Rolster or Liiv SANDBOX or some of these other teams that have really kind of proven themselves to be somewhere near the top 4, top 5 teams in the LCK. You're solid, but not great. And Hanwha and Effort, you know, credit to them. They've continued to improve, but I don't know if it's going to be enough to push Bro into the top 6, where I think a lot of people would want to put them. Moving on to our second game here of day number 2, and this was the upset of the week, in my opinion. Certainly a team getting back on track here, as we saw T1 taking on Hanwha Liiv Esports. And you know what? Credit to HLE, they picked up a huge win here. And honestly, I didn't expect it. I felt like this team was completely inept through their first few games. It felt like they were just scratching to a lot of the wins they ended up getting in the first place. They had some major issues, but the truth of it is, it looks like you can't take last year's DRX out of these solo laners. They are still here, and they're still going to upset T1 in games that are incredibly important, I think, for both of them. T1 loses their undefeated streak here in the LCK. Hanwha Liiv picks up a win that they crucially need here in 3 games. It certainly wasn't a one-sided series, but Hanwha honestly looked better in most of the series. I think even in game 1, where T1 had control and they were the better team, Hanwha definitely showed some signs of life in that one as well, pun entirely intended here. So let's go ahead and go over the series. Game 1 was a T1 win off of KIA. Again, KIA does this every single week. He picks an AD carry, he puts Guma on support duty, and then he carries the game, and that's what he did here. He was able to get a ton of gold on the Jhin. I know some people are really frustrated that he was the one picking up all the gold on the Jhin. I would honestly say, especially looking at Hanwha Liiv's comp, that that's going to be a little bit better this game. Ziggs is a little bit more avoidable, in my opinion, than someone like Jhin, who can do a lot of damage in these late game team fights if he does have that damage on him. So I'm certainly not going to blame KIA for being the one to take over that game number 1. He continues to pull out these AD carry for support picks and make them look really good. Faker had some good moments in game 1, some bad moments in game 1, but I think Zeus winning in the top lane was another big standout for T1. And then games 2 and 3 were actually relatively similar in terms of how they performed, although I would say it's backwards. Game 2 was a Draven comp on the side of T1 that they just were not able to get ahead. Draven was super far behind in that game. He had to play ridiculously passive because he got set really far behind, that he would, that CC chain coming out from Ornn and Wukong and potentially Yuumi would just cause him to die. Akali blowing him up, Lucian blowing him up. There were so many things that he had to be wary of because he wasn't able to generate that, like, I'm gonna kill you instantly gold in the early game that ended up not really working out. I know a lot of people on Reddit are gonna sit there and be like, worst draft of all time. But anybody who follows the channel, first of all, knows that one of my main thoughts on draft and why I don't usually talk about it a lot in these series unless it's like ridiculously egregious is, quite frankly, better teams win bad drafts. Like, the best teams in the world win losing drafts all the time. It is incredibly common to do so, and T1 should be a team that can beat Hanwha Life with a bad draft. They had a win condition on this comp. Like, there was a way for them to win it. They just didn't execute it. I mean, as bad as the draft was, right? Like, you can say, yeah, Hanwha Life had an easier way to win the game. I agree with that. But to say that T1 couldn't win this game by being the better team is just not true. And I think that is just generally the case for a lot of the bad drafts. I think T1 fans in general, not to go on a little bit of a tangent here, but it's insane how that's really the only thing you ever see in any sort of post-match thread with T1 is just bad draft, bad draft, bad draft. It's never like, oh, Faker played really bad on the Taliyah. Oh, Gumayusi got set behind super far early, so they couldn't win. Like, none of the actual reasons that they lose the game are ever really brought up. It's just draft, draft, draft. You gotta love scapegoats. But moving on, game 2, definitely kind of frustrating. Gumayusi was set behind super far early on the Draven in that comp and just was never able to recover. HLE did a really good job of pushing that advantage, specifically Klid on the Wukong, who did a really good job knowing exactly where he needed to be, knowing exactly how to get T1 behind in the early game. And then credit to Kingen up on the top side. We'll talk about him a bit more as we get into the overall series recap, but him back on tanks, he looks good doing it. Weak side Kingen is incredibly strong. After getting bodied in game 1, felt like he had a much, much better game 2 where he really just outclassed Zeus, especially early on that Ornn in my opinion. And then you move into game 3, and game 3 was all Hanwha Life. It was Klid in the early game on this Elise. Looking at the Hanwha Life draft, I honestly dislike this draft more than I dislike T1's game 2 draft because I do not like Elise, Kassadin, and Draven as like a trio here to try and win with. I think Elise, Kassadin in particular as a jungle mid duo is maybe the worst that's in the meta right now. I think these two champions just simply do not play off of each other in any meaningful way, but when you're the better team, you can make it work. When you play better, you can make it work. And Klid had such a good early game. He was able to get Viper super far ahead on this Draven, something that T1 was just not able to do in game number 2. And Viper was able to take care of a lot of the mid-game damage. You were allowed to get Zeka into that late-game hyperscaling Kassadin mindset, especially once he hit that level 11, because you had a lot of pressure on the bot side of the map. And you have to remember, the thing about Elise, I talk about this quite frequently, is that Elise is, typically seen as a champion that is early game and falls off in the mid to late game. That is only true because her survivability and her ability to make those plays falls off in the mid to late game. Her damage does not fall off. If you have this big, pick-oriented comp with a lot of burst damage like Draven, like Kassadin in the mid-game, you can still make a lot of plays on this Elise, and you could still be very influential, which Klid was in this game. And honestly, it was a pretty easy choice for player of the series, in my opinion. It's going to go to Klid here on Hanwha Life. He was really, really good. I mean, I know Klid's been a little bit of a meme at the beginning of the season. He's been quite bad for a team that was supposed to overperform, a team with some world champions on it, a team with maybe the best AD carry in the world last year on it. You had a lot of expectations, and Klid really felt like he was the one holding the team back at the beginning of the year. He was really good in this series. He was the one pushing them forward, in my opinion. He certainly wasn't the only player on the team that was playing well. Credit to Kingen. He always feels better when he's on weak side tanks in the top lane. That's really where I liked him in 2022 summer last year, when he felt like he was kind of getting back into that groove, when I was kind of considering him and ended up putting him in my third team All-Pros, because he was probably the most stable weak side top laner in the entire region last year, and that was incredibly impressive. He got right back onto that in game number 2 on the Ornn, game number 3 on the Sion, both which were really solid for him. And then Viper finally showed up here for Hanwha Life. I know he's had some good games this year, but he really hasn't had that big takeover performance like he did in Game 3 in this series. I'm just happy to see it. I'm happy to see that it's still there, that he can still do it, because through a lot of this year so far, it's really felt like, oh no, is Viper just not, Viper anymore? Is he going to come back to the LCK and just kind of be meh, be an okay AD carry? well, this was a sign that he can at least still be a top tier 1 going up against a very good ADC like Gumayusi in this series. So overall, Hanwha looking really, really solid. For T1, you got to be a little bit frustrated with this loss. You really have no reason to lose this series, especially against a team that is struggling as hard as Hanwha, but that's kind of what T1 does, is they drop random games throughout the split. That's just what top teams in the LCK do. My dud of that series is actually going to go to Guma. I feel bad giving it to him because I don't think it's entirely his fault, but game number 2 in particular, he was set super far behind on the Draven, and from that point onwards, he was like a complete zero impact on the game. I think he actually did less damage than Liiv did on the Yuumi in game number 2, which is just, it's not good, right? When you're in that situation, it's just not good. Again, it's not entirely his fault, but, you know, it is a little bit his fault. And then game number 3, he just got outplayed by Viper. Viper was just significantly better in game number 3. So for me, Guma's going to get done of the series. I think him and KIA have been really strong to start the year, but in my opinion, this is easily their worst series. KIA didn't really help all that much, kind of went back to the more traditional supports in games 2 and 3, and I think that actually hurt the team as a whole. I think this team has looked a lot better when KIA gets to play these more carry-oriented bot laners, things like the Jhin, like he did in game number 1, and Guma can play more of that secondary carry role, you know, things like the Kalista, things like the Ashe that they have been pulling out. And so for T1, you know, I'm not exactly sure if they should just go back to that playstyle, but they tried to play a little bit more standard, and the bot lane looked a lot worse in this series, so that is something worth noting. Faker had good moments, bad moments. Owner had good moments and bad moments. Zeus had really good moments and then really bad moments. I feel like his pluses and minuses were more extreme in this series than most. His game number 1 on Jace was dominant. Obviously, it's Zeus's Jace. It's a signature pick. But he dominated Kingen in game number 1. And then, honestly, he was completely and utterly useless, especially in game number 2 on this Renekton. That's kind of what you get with Zeus, especially going into a player like Kingen, who's really good at just nullifying a lot of the aggressive play that a player like Zeus uses to generate a lot of his leads in the 1v1s. And so, overall for T1, I still think that they are probably the best team in the league. I think this is just a little bit of a speed bump. They're kind of getting their footing in terms of what they want to draft, the comps that they kind of want to go for. I'm not going to sit here and pull the plug on T1 just because they lost to Hanwha Life. I think mostly for me, this is a credit to Hanwha Life. It feels like they are really starting to get back into form. They're starting to look a lot better. Hopefully they can keep that up, because this is a team that really has no reason to be outside of the top 4 in terms of the talent that is on the team. If Klid can just play passively good, like passively good, I think is what I'm looking for, then I think this team is going to be fine. Viper looked a lot better this series. Kingen looked a lot better this series. Zeka's probably been the best performing member of the team up until this point. If they can just kind of roll this out, if they look like they did in this series for the rest of the spring split, this team will kind of get to the expectations. They maybe just took a little bit of a crazy route to get there. Moving on now to day number 3, it's time to keep the upset train rolling, as we saw a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs, the winless Kwangdong Freecs, and KT Rolster, and of course KT lost the series 0-2. Like, is anyone really surprised by this? This is KT Rolster. This is just being KT Rolster in a nutshell. I know I've got a ton of KT Rolster fans in my comments section. Are any of you surprised? Because I'm not surprised. This is just what this organization does year after year after year, is they find a way to lose to the 1-8 Kwangdong Freecs, or whoever it ends up being. And honestly, they look pretty bad in doing so. They just look completely uncoordinated. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about KDF first, because I actually think they played really well this series. This jungle mid duo was actually kind of solid, and we knew that going into the year. We knew Youngjae and Bulldog were going to be kind of the driving force for KDF. Dudu on the top side was someone who I was kind of hoping was going to get closer to his 2022 form, somebody who was actually pretty positive for a bad Hanwha Life team over the course of that year. I was very concerned about the bot lane, though. And honestly, everything kind of clicked for KDF here. I think mostly it was who we thought it was going to be, this jungle mid duo, kind of pushing everything forward. Game number 1 was Youngjae on that Maokai really just taking over the map, doing a much better job of pushing his advantage than Cuz did on the Sejuani, and just creating circumstances where Taiyun on the Zeri was able to take over in a lot of these late game team fights. Of course, we can talk about KT Rolster just being completely uncoordinated. That fight around Dragon Pit is the biggest example of that, of Keen flashing in on the Renekton, immediately dying, and then BDD trying to stun the rest of the team to keep the team fight going. Like, clearly there was just some major miscommunications here between the team, and it did not work out, but you know, credit to KDF, they did what they needed to do in game number 1, but game number 2 really was a good example of Tristana mid, and why you would want to pick it. Great job from Bulldog to be able to get ahead early against the Kassadin. You knew you were going to be able to bully him in lane, you clearly knew you were going to be able to try and take over the game from that point onwards, and a lot of people that we've seen play Tristana mid, most notably the LEC, who seems to pull it out religiously right now, have not been able to translate any sort of lead that they generate in the early to mid game into the late game. They've not been able to push that advantage by really just skirmishing 24/7, like keeping the other team on their back toes. And KDF did a really good job of doing that. Bulldog in particular, I think, looked really solid in that game number 2, so much so that he is going to be my player of the series here. I know a lot of people in my comment section told me that I was underrating Bulldog as a player, and perhaps I was. He does seem to be a pretty good mid laner, someone who can be competent at this level. I think there are a lot of pretty good mid laners in the LCK right now, and so it's not a particularly ridiculous statement to say that he is right up there with him. But this performance itself was really solid. Probably my favorite of the year so far from KDF and from Bulldog in particular was this Tristana game 2. He's had some moments where he's looked good in some of KDF's losses, but for the most part, this entire team has just looked outclassed for most of the year, and I think that has included Bulldog in the mid lane, I should say, except for Tristana in game number 2 here. The Victor game in game number 1 was also good, but he just wasn't necessarily like the big standout in the same way that he was in game number 2. But then you've also got Gen.G here. I thought another really good series from him. He was actually the player I was most excited about going into the year. He was the player I was looking at on KDF and being like, if he really pans out, I could be really interested in this team. Very, very strong Maokai game in game number 1 where it felt like he did a good job controlling the map, controlling the pacing. I talk about that a lot on this channel, and clearly that's something I value a lot in junglers. It's the reason I have Peanut as the number 1 jungler in the LCK, because junglers that can control the pacing and allow their teammates to kind of do whatever they want on the map, I think just have, generally speaking, more consistency and more success in the league rather than junglers that go for these big risky plays that try to carry the game. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and that's not a bad thing. You know, a jungler like that can be very positive for the team. I personally value consistency, and it feels like Gen.G is kind of built in that mold where he wants to be a little bit more consistent, maybe on these more supportive picks, and I do really think that's worked out for them. He had a good game on the Wukong in game 2. And then credit to Taiyun and June. They've been really poor to start the year, one of the worst bot lanes in the entire league. But they were really good. Game number 1, they were important in team fights. That Zeri obviously popping off towards the back half of the game, even if it wasn't entirely, Taiyun and June playing particularly great. And then game number 2, they were good as well into the Sivir Karma. It's really good to be able to generate those early leads against scaling bot lanes like Sivir. I do particularly like Sivir right now in the meta because I do think it matches up well against something like Zeri. But if you do generate that lead on Zeri again, she's just so difficult to actually deal with. So great win for KDF. This is a team that only won 1 game before this series, and so for them to get a 2-0, that's really great. But for KT Rolster, you gotta be frustrated with this team. I mean, we know they're feast or famine. I talked about it all the time, not only in my preseason rankings, but in basically every other game that they've played. This is a team that when they hit, they look great. Especially, this bot lane. When they hit, they look great. When they don't hit, this team looks awful, and that's kind of what happened here. I'm not going to blame the bot lane. I think they were fine. Again, I think they've easily been the best part of this KT Rolster team so far in 2023, but these solo laners are just not working together. It does not feel like they are in comms. Like, it does not feel like they are talking to one another, because they are not on the same page at all. Keen and BDD, in particular, are just not on the same page. I already talked about the incident in game 1, but I think it permeates the rest of the game as well, where Keen will try to make these more aggressive plays, and BDD will just not be ready for them. It feels like he's not prepared to follow up on any of these aggressive engages that Keen tries to make in team fights. I thought Keen was really bad in game number 1. For that, he's going to get my dud of the series. I thought he was a lot better in game 2 and actually had some good moments, but even still, I don't think he had any impact on the game. He still was relatively useless overall, and I think Keen's game 1 was probably the weakest game that anybody had in this series. He continues to look a little bit weak on this KT Rolster team. I think the solo lanes have certainly been up and down for KT Rolster. BDD has had some good games. He's had some bad games, but this was a couple of bad games from BDD as well. I think he was able to do some damage in both. He was able to kind of clean up some kills, but if he was a little bit more proactive with some of the decisions that he was able to make, and again, can't stress this enough, if he was on the same page as a player like Keen, I think that KT could have actually won game number 1, or at least put themselves in a position to fight for game number 1. But again, them just inting towards the back half of the game made it basically impossible for them to be in any situation where they could win. Cuz plays horrible from behind. He's just one of those junglers who can play well from ahead, plays bad from behind. It's kind of just who Cuz is on KT Rolster. He's been getting behind a lot more recently, and I think that is a problem, especially against a player like Gen.G that he really has no right to be losing to. And so Cuz, again, I'm lower on him as a player, just generally speaking, and I think that has kind of come through so far in 2023. Aiming and lines are fine. They tried their best on the Sivir, but, only so much you can do when your top side is losing. This series is certainly not on them, in my opinion, but KT Rolster in general just has a lot of shit that they have to figure out. They are not looking good right now. They have a lot of things that they need to kind of shore up in terms of consistency if they want to be a top 4 team. I mean, top 4 is so achievable for basically any team in the league right now, and it feels like nobody actually wants to take that spot. The top 3 teams feel very good, and then that 4th spot is so wide open for basically anybody. KT felt like the most reliable choice up until this point in the year, but after this, like, I have no idea. It just feels like nobody wants to hang on to a spot where they actually feel comfortable in that top 4. KT honestly looks very bad in this series, and hopefully they're going to be able to rebound later in the week. But for KDF, great way to pick up your first win of the season against an actually good team. The players that you were really hoping kind of delivered in this series. I think Gen.G and Bulldog in particular looked fantastic. Hopefully they can keep up, continue the development. I don't think that this team is ever going to be contending for top 6. I think this win is very good for them, but I don't think it's indicative of a larger win streak coming for KDF. I think it's just good to know that these players are kind of moving in the right direction, and that hopefully, you know, sitting here at the end of the spring, we can look at some of these players and say, yeah, they had moments like this a lot more often. Moving on to our second series here of day number 3, we had 2 teams that are sitting at 4-1, both trying to solidify themselves at the top of the standings. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G continues their strong run of form to start the year here. This team is actually looking very, very good, and I'm very happy and impressed to say that. Liiv SANDBOX actually, honestly, is still looking pretty good in this series, but Gen.G is definitely the better team. Let's go ahead and talk about them first. I actually really did like what they were able to do in this series. They were kind of down in game number 1. They weren't looking all of that cohesive, especially Peanut and Chovy, who just kind of had bad games in game number 1. It happens every so often. I talk about this all the time. If we overreact to one bad game, then I don't think we get a very good picture of, you know, who's actually performing well. Chovy did not have a very good game number 1 on the Azir. Obviously, the copy pasta lives on forever with Gen.G picking Renekton and Azir in the same game. You gotta love that for them, but it didn't particularly work out in game number 1. Game number 2 was a lot better for them, I would say, mostly due to the fact that this Gwen pick just completely nullified a lot of the success that Liiv SANDBOX was able to generate in that first game. Obviously, we've talked about Gwen into Cassante not exactly being the 1v1 counter pick that I think a lot of people wanted it to be. Gwen is not particularly great into Cassante just by herself if you're the worst player, or if you're a worst player, you know, kind of, you know what I mean. But what Gwen does really well is stop the auto attack barrage that happens in a lot of these team fights, and she really can output a ridiculous amount of damage if you can peel for her. And that's what Doran did in game number 2, certainly the big standout in that game in my opinion. And then game number 3, kind of back and forth I would say overall. Doran gets solo killed up in the top lane as Gnar against an Aurelia, but lucky for them, you've got Pez on this Varus who can just really take over the mid to late game. Chovy does a stellar job of being able to keep the macro game in check on the Ryze. I talk about Ryze potentially being a little bit of a trap pick for worse players because of the difficulty of execution that I think it takes for him to be what he should be at a high level. That does not apply to Chovy. Obviously, he can play whatever he wants. He's fantastic on that champion. Ryze into Cassio is incredibly Cassio favored, and for Ryze to be able to have such an impact on the game, a much bigger impact than what Closer had on the Cassio, was honestly incredibly impressive from Gen.G. And then just generally speaking, Envy did nothing over the last 2 games, and I think that helped them out a lot as well. So, talking about it, player of the series for Gen.G is going to go to Pez for me. He was by far the most influential player in game number 3. I think if Doran hadn't been solo killed in game number 3, if he had been a little bit more proactive early on in the laning phase, hadn't made the same kind of mistakes that he honestly makes quite frequently up in the top lane in laning phase, he probably would have been my player of the series, because his game 2 on the Gwen is really what shifted the tide for Gen.G in my opinion. But it was hard to give Doran player of the series when both game 1 and game 3 really weren't all that good from him. He was the worst player on the team in game number 3, so not really a lot to like there, but his game number 2 truly was spectacular and probably the best game of the series from anybody on Gen.G. But Pez for me on the Varus in particular in game number 3 was able to put out so much damage. He had the peel, he had the macro presence coming out from Chovy. It was all really just strong play from Gen.G. I think Pez has really grown into that role. Obviously, replacing Ruler is never going to be easy and it's never going to be simple, but I think Pez has grown very quickly into a player that can keep up with a lot of the other AD carries, obviously, in the LCK, and honestly surpass them. Like, he's playing at an MVP level right now, just like Ruler was last year, and it just feels like the system at Gen.G just produces talent over and over again in those positions, basically no matter who is stepping in. Not to say that Pez isn't a ridiculous talent. We knew going into the year that Pez was almost certainly going to be Rookie of the Year, that he was the best prospect coming up from the LCK but for him to be as good as he is, as quickly as he is, and just, you know, all the positioning, you know, great things that he's doing, basically making no major mistakes, it's just incredibly impressive. I have to give Pez the credit that he deserves. Delight has stepped into his role well. I don't think he played perfect in this series, certainly not as well as he did in the series earlier this week against Dplus KIA, but still a really good series from him. Chovy had a rough couple of first games, but was fantastic in game 3, and then, like I said, Doran was also really, really good in game number 2, probably the best single-game performance from Gen.G in this series. But for Liiv SANDBOX, on the other hand, not particularly bad. Like, I don't think that this was a bad series by any means. There are certainly some things that I think you could improve on. Closer and Envy were so good in game number 1 on the Sylas and Varus that it's almost frustrating how bad Envy was for the rest of the series. Shout out to Pez. Wasn't particularly good on the Jhin in game number 1, and then as soon as they took him off of the Jhin, a pick that I think a lot of people have really maligned for good reason over the past few weeks, all of a sudden, Envy can't really keep up with him. He's just not on the same page. Envy in game number 2 did negative damage because of that Gwen. Couldn't really get anything in. Also, when Kalista ulted Envy, I don't know if he realized he didn't have to go all the way in and immediately die in all of the engages. That's something that you just don't have to do as Varus if you don't want to. And then game number 3, Mandate Ash's AD carry just doesn't feel all that good. It's not particularly what I wanted to see out of him in game number 3, and so Envy wasn't great, but his game number 1 saves him from being done to the series. That, for me, is going to go to Willer, because it just didn't feel like he had any impact in any of the games. Even in game number 1, it felt like he was the least important member of that team. Bertle was really, really solid in game 1, and he was awesome in game 3. He was actually really strong in lane. Closer was fantastic in game 1 and had some moments in game 3. Envy was great in game 1. Kale was great in game 1. Willer was okay in game 1, and then was just kind of out-jungled by Peanut the rest of the series. So for me, he's going to get done to the series. I think he's been really good and has overperformed expectations this year. It's okay to have one bad series against the best jungler in the league. It's not the end of the world, and I honestly don't think he was like the individual worst player on the team in any of their games. I just think combined, he was the player that impressed me the least. I think every other player had like a highlight moment in the series. Willer just did not have that for me. So overall for Liiv SANDBOX, not a bad series. I think losing to Gen.G is certainly not the end of the road for any team, and for you to be able to keep up with them relatively okay, you know, looking good in game 1 and then having moments in game 3 where you look competitive, I think it's a good sign considering where this team was projected to be. I think it proves that they're not necessarily on that level. This is not a team that's going to be competing for top 3 or anything like that. I just don't think Liiv SANDBOX is necessarily in that conversation, but you know, they looked good enough to lead me to believe that this is definitely a team that deserves to be, you know, right smack dab in the middle of the playoff conversation, which is more than I can say for almost any other team in the LCK right now. But for Gen.G, they're really solidifying themselves as one of the best teams in the league. Liiv SANDBOX is not a pushover by any stretch of the imagination, and Gen definitely outplayed them in this series. I think a lot of their young players, a lot of their question marks, their bot lane in particular, are stepping up. Chovy, even when he has bad games, still does some really good things, and he definitely can respond and adapt very well as series goes on. Peanut is very consistent. Doran, even though he has some bad moments, has some really good moments as well. Gen.G is incredibly strong, and this team might be a lot closer to 2022 Gen.G than we were giving them credit for at the beginning of the year. Moving on to day 4 now. We kicked day 4 off with a matchup that I think a lot of people were looking forward to at the beginning of the year. Some former teammates and some old organizations facing off against each other. We had Hanwha Life Esports taking on DRX. Of course, 2 members of the DRX team that just won Worlds here on Hanwha and Kingen and Zeka in the solo lanes. And so a lot of people were really looking forward to kind of this revenge game from Kingen and Zeka, or potentially revenge game from DRX for having their players leave. You know, it kind of lived up to expectations. The series was, in fact, interesting. But at the end of the day, it was proven that Hanwha is just simply the better team, as they should be, and they were able to pick up the 2-1 series win over a continuously struggling DRX team. For Hanwha, okay, I don't want to buy in just yet, because this series was not clean by any stretch. Game 1 was a pretty strong showing from DRX, certainly not one that Hanwha would be proud of, but Game 2, incredibly in Hanwha's favor. Game number 3, Hanwha comes from behind to win the game. I'm starting to believe again. It's a lot of the reasons that I was excited about this team in the first place is it felt like they had a lot of cohesion in terms of styles and how they wanted to play the game. Maybe not in terms of like the actual players and the personalities, etc., etc. We didn't know what they were going to be like, but stylistically, it felt like this team had a very clear identity for how they wanted to play the game. and they really do feel like they're starting to execute on that a bit as we go further on into the season. Player of the series for me is again going to go to Klid. He was the scapegoat for Hanwha Life through their first couple of weeks, rightfully so. He was very bad in these early games. He was constantly throwing away gold advantages that his laners were able to create, giving his team zero pressure, not able to land smites, not able to get ganks off. He was honestly very, very bad through the first couple of weeks of the season. However, as we move into week 3 now, we have to be honest with ourselves. He was really good this week. He was one of the best players in the entire league this week, not only in the early game where he did a much better job knowing where he wanted to go, knowing what his gank paths and patterns were supposed to look like, especially on a champion like Elise, that he did a very good job on in game number 3 of, but on a champion like Viego, where he was able to generate a huge lead for his AD carry, who also continued to play really good in this series. And obviously, we're going to talk about it now. Being able to land that smite in game number 3 on the coin flip 50-50 Baron was absolutely huge. That's what won Hanwha Life the series, and so Klid doing a great job of keeping his head on straight. I talked about this in week 1 and in week 2 when it came to Hanwha Life, and most specifically when it came to Klid. It was never a huge question for me whether or not Klid could actually do it. I know people on Reddit were talking like, oh, Klid's never actually been good. You know, he was just inflated by being on good teams. I was never in that camp, and I never believed that. I never said anything like that. For me, and you can go back and watch this, it was all mentality. It was just, can Klid recognize, okay, these are a couple of bad games, but the season is long, it's only spring, I just need to calm down and get my head back on track. If he can do that, then I felt like this Hanwha team could stay in that top 6, could continue to get back to where we all thought they could be in the preseason, and you know what? He's starting to do it. Now, Hanwha's not perfect, we'll get to that in a bit. They certainly made some mistakes in this series, but Klid getting back on track, I think, helps Hanwha out a ton, and it really does feel like he is back in the zone in terms of playing with this team. Credit to Viper as well. I think he's the other player that I really want to shout out. I was really worried about Viper after the first couple of weeks. He wasn't playing with that aggression, that intensity that he played with EDG on for the past 2 years, but when he's on this Draven pick, it certainly changes. He looks very aggressive. He very much wants to try and punish the enemy bot lane. Now, it doesn't hurt that Beryl is completely running it in a lot of these games, but Viper being able to take advantage of those opportunities is something that I'm not sure he would have done in the first couple of weeks when he was getting acclimated back to the LCK. That aggressive mentality, even in game 2 on the Varus, where he was willing to step up, willing to trade, willing to fight, I think helped out the team a ton, in my opinion, and those two players were really the ones that stood out for me. I still think HLE has their problems. In terms of early games, I don't think that they are the best laners, which is honestly a little bit confusing. Viper's a fantastic laner. Zeka's a fantastic laner. I'm surprised that they're not able to generate the same kind of consistent leads, but honestly, big credit, we'll give it here now, to Krako on the side of DRX. I actually thought he was really good in this series at being able to control the pacing of the early game, even with Klid making some good plays on the Viego and on the Elise. I thought Krako did a good job of making sure that DRX was able to stay in the game, particularly in game number 3 on the Maokai. Obviously, it's an awful call to coin flip Baron in that game because you're actually in a pretty commanding spot, but up until that point, I thought Krako was playing relatively well. Fate was doing relatively well in lane as well, and then honestly, huge shout out to Dektum. I thought Dektum played this series phenomenally, most specifically this game number 3 on the Ezreal, where he was a really good function for this team. He was, in my opinion, probably the best mechanical performer on the side of DRX. I know Dektum gets a lot of shit, but people just seem to turn off their brain and forget a lot of the games last year that he was able to win for Damwon in the late game on things like the Aphelios, obviously his signature pick. He can do that. He is a very good late game team fighter and a very good positioner. When he has good laning phases, he's an incredibly strong AD carry in this league. There's just only so much you can do when your support constantly runs it down, dude. Like, it is insane how bad Beryl has been to start the year. A pretty easy choice for Dead of the Series again here. I'm not going to sit here and say that Beryl is the reason they lost this series, but he certainly is the biggest reason that they lost this series. I think Krako, missing that smite, 50-50ing it was not good, but Beryl just giving over so much gold to Viper all series long was so detrimental to DRX's chances of actually winning games 2 or game 3 where they had control. He has just been horrendous over the last couple of games. There really is no other way to put it. I can't stress to you enough how bad Beryl was over the course of week 3. And, longtime LCK fans, and especially longtime DRX fans, I guess longtime, a year plus long DRX fans, know that this is just what you get with Beryl. This is what he was doing last year. He had weeks in the season, where this team, obviously we made fun of this team last year for flip-flopping between 0-2 and then 2-0, and then 0-2 and then 2-0 every single week. Those 0-2 weeks, Beryl would look like the worst player in the LCK, and he did it again here in this week. It just happens with him. He is going to have his good moments, but to pretend like he is consistent in any imagination is just not true. This is not all that surprising to me to happen. This is exactly what DRX was going through in summer of last year, and it just seems to have carried over to DRX this year. Another horrendously bad week for Beryl, a very easy choice for Dud of the Week, which sucks, because I actually think the 4 other players on this team played relatively well. Dectim I already talked about. Krako had some really good moments until he lost that Baron. Fate was looking really good in terms of damage. Rascal I thought was fine in the top lane, punishing a lot of those tank picks from King and being able to generate leads. It's just Beryl was giving over so much gold, and Hanwha knew exactly what to do with it, that the games were essentially over at that point. So outlook-wise, DRX is struggling. I think if Beryl continues to run it, Krako, Fate, Rascal, Dectim, they're looking a lot better than they did in the early parts of the season, but it honestly won't matter if Beryl continues to be as bad as he is. He is just not someone who will lose gracefully. That has just never been the case with Beryl, and that continues on here. And then for Hanwha, 2-0 week. I mean, you're back to 500. That's awesome. Like, nobody was really kind of looking at this team as a team that was a bounce-back candidate with how Klid was playing, with how Liiv was playing in the first couple weeks of the season. Hell, even how Viper was playing in the first couple weeks of the season. But Klid and Viper in particular had fantastic week 3s. And, looking at this team now, this is kind of, we're getting a lot closer, I think, to where they were at the beginning of the preseason in terms of projections. But I do need to say, it wasn't perfect. They still have a lot of room to go before I could confidently say that they're a top 4-ish team and they can actually compete with the upper echelon, but you got to take baby steps to get there, and I think they absolutely did that starting this week. Moving on to our second series here of day number 4. We had an interesting match, top versus bottom. We always talk about these as if they're not supposed to be close, but of course in the LCK they are. We had T1 taking on NS RedForce, and yes, T1 is able to actually pull out the win, which seems contrary to what everything else has happened this week would tell you would happen here, but NS does certainly make it close. They're actually able to take game number 2 in this game, looking really good doing so. T1 looking a little bit troll in that loss. We'll get to that in a bit, but T1, for the most part, looking like T1 in this series. They still are limit testing to an extent. The Ezreal Twitch bot lane in game number 2 is insane, and it doesn't quite work, but at the same time, I guess you gotta try stuff in order to know if it works or it doesn't, but KIA, man. Whew, that was a game number 2. Let's talk about T1. My player of the series is going to go to Faker in the mid lane. He was just by far the most consistent member of this team over the course of the series. I don't know if he was necessarily the single best performer in either of their wins, because I do think KIA in game number 1 was absolutely insane on the Ashe. That ult cooldown is just ridiculous when you play support Ashe. It is just kind of ludicrous how easy it is to fire that thing off. And then I think Owner bouncing back in game number 3 looked fantastic. The problem was game number 2, where KIA and Owner in particular, those two, looked atrociously bad. It was just almost impossible for me to give either of them player of the series here when both of them played as bad as they did in game number 2. So it's going to go to Faker. He had a great game number 1 on the Victor, completely outclassed Fiesta in terms of being able to control the map and being able to push forward and deal damage in these late game team fights. So I think you could realistically give Faker player of the game in game number 1, and it wouldn't be all that ridiculous, even if I do think KIA played a tad bit better, but Faker just continues to be kind of the consistent presence for this team, which is honestly kind of different than what he was in the regular season for them last year. Not that he wasn't consistent last year, but rather it felt like everybody else was getting a lot of resources, and Faker was kind of on these more supportive champions. I mean, he played a shit ton of Talia, he played a shit ton of Lissandra over the course of last year. That's just kind of what he did. To see him on Victor and Azir all year long and being able to deal damage, it's a good thing. I really like seeing it because it's Faker on a champion that can actually deal damage. Obviously, I'm going to be into it, and so, him being given that opportunity, I think a tad bit more in 2023 than what he had in 2022, I think is overall positive for T1, and of course he's going to pay it off. He's the greatest player of all time, and so pretty easy choice for player of the series, but shout out to KIA and Owner. Each of them had a pretty spectacular game where they really, really dominated. Again, KIA in game 1 and Owner in game 3, but both of them were so ridiculously troll in game number 2 that it was almost impossible for me to realistically give them player of the series. Guma was actually really good in game number 2 on the Ezreal. He tried his absolute best to save that game along with Faker, but God, KIA was just running it so badly on the Twitch that it was not salvageable. It sounds like I'm flaming KIA, but again, he was so freaking good in games 1 and 3. It was just that game 2 that was so bad. Guma looked good this series. I thought Zeus looked good this series. He always looks good on Jace. What a big shocker. So overall, I think T1 looking pretty solid, even if they did troll a tad bit towards the middle bit of this series. As for Nongshim on the other side, they definitely weren't onto the same level of T1. They were able to take game number 2. Huge big props to them, but I think they were more so taking advantage of some awful plays from Owner and KIA than they were like actively pushing their own leads and their own advantages. I can't really look at anybody on the side of Nongshim and be like, yeah, they really dominated and they, just outplayed their counterpart on T1. I mean, Sylvie and Peter in particular did in game number 2, but I would say that was more on Owner and KIA than it was on Sylvie and Peter. And Sylvie in particular looked really bad in both games 1 and 3, most specifically game 1, where he just got completely run over. I mean, he was useless. So Sylvie's going to get my dud of the series. I really like him as a player, and I think he's actually been pretty good, arguably the best player for this Nongshim team. I think him and Fiesta have kind of traded that back and forth a bit over the course of the year so far. But going up against T1 is a little bit of a different story. Clearly, he was a little bit nervous. I think the rest of the team was feeling kind of good. We saw that after the series ended. They lost 2-1, and they were walking away all smiles. I mean, they kept up with T1, so I could see why they would have been a little bit excited. They probably never went into the series expecting to be able to win anyways, so the loss probably didn't hurt all that bad, but it did seem like the nerves kind of got to Sylvie in the jungle, who just was not able to keep up, especially in that game 1 on the Elise. Not very good from him. Fiesta just got outplayed by Faker all series long. He was not in the same vicinity in terms of skill level. And then Vital. I actually thought Vital positioned really well. I know a lot of people are really making fun of his Aphelios build in game number 1, going Collector second. I kind of understand it. I also understand why you wouldn't go that, especially into the comp that T1 had. But for the most part, I think that Vital was relatively fine, and so was Peter in this series. I think overall for Nongshim, some good, some bad. You were able to keep up with T1. I think even if your jungle mid was kind of outplayed in this series, the fact that your bot lane, I think, was relatively okay into T1 was honestly pleasantly surprising. I think that there were a lot of moments where I felt like Nongshim was just not going to be able to keep up, especially in game 1. And so to see them be able to kind of hold on, at least have a it has some substance in game number 2, I think is positive overall for Nongshim. They're not really going to be a team that competes. They're one of the bottom 3 teams in the league, pretty clearly, in my opinion. But, credit to them, they were able to keep up, and they kind of did their job here. As for T1, you're going to be glad to walk out of the series with a W. You looked really good in your wins, but it did feel more like a limit testing series than anything else. It didn't feel like they were taking it all that seriously, especially with the crazy misplays in game number 3. If you haven't seen that clip on Twitter, I suggest you go check it out. The LCK tweeted it out. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've seen the game where everybody just misses all their abilities. It's pretty funny. This series is just kind of goofy all around. Nobody was really taking it all that seriously, and I think that included the players, maybe with the exception of Faker, who did look relatively locked in. But for T1, you're going to be happy to walk out of the series with a dub, but truly I don't think that there really is a lot to glean from these 3 games. That's going to bring us to our 5th and final day of games here in the LCK Week 3, and we kicked it off with a pretty dominant series between KT Rolster and BRION that KT Rolster really just dominated. I mean, they just ran over Bro, especially in that game number 2. This is what I'm talking about with KT Rolster. Like, how do I evaluate this team? They get absolutely schmacked by Kwangdong Freecs earlier in the week. Maybe the worst team in the entire league. I mean, if I'm being entirely honest, they have been over the first few weeks. They have 1 game up until that point. And then they destroy BRION, who has been competitive with teams just as good as KT Rolster. I don't know how to evaluate this team. Like, I don't know where to sit in terms of my opinion, because the feast or famine-ness of KT Rolster is just not real. I feel like KT fans should be happy that I'm not super in on them. Anytime anybody gets excited about KT Rolster, the team just immediately starts shitting the bed. And so, for me to be hesitant about them, honestly, KT fans, you should be happy that I say that. But what a win. I mean, absolutely dominant. Let's talk about KT Rolster. Everybody else looked good in this series because they utterly obliterated them, but if I have to pick out 3 people in particular, I'm going to pick out Keen, I'm going to pick out BDD, and I'm going to pick out Lehens. All 3 of which were fantastic. I talked about the solo laners being incredibly hit or miss for KT Rolster and being quite bad for them earlier in the week against KDF in particular. Well, that was not true in this series at all. Maybe Keen was just doing his former org some favors, his longtime former org some favors by giving them a win. But he bounced back pretty freaking hard in this series. He is going to get my Player of the Series award here for KT. He was fantastic and genuinely fantastic in game number 1. Easily the biggest reason why they were able to win that game, because that game was much closer. And then game 2, everybody dominated, and that definitely included Keen, who just obliterated the Cassante and the top lane on that Camille. Very, very fun performance. This is what you wanted to see out of Keen. The carry top laner that was awesome in the 1v1 top lane matchups that could translate those leads into ridiculous ridiculous teamfight damage. That's what Keen was for so many years. That's why people considered him one of, if not the best top laner in the LCK for quite a bit of time. That's what you wanted to see come here to KT Rolster. That's what we got in this series out of Keen. And then BDD was fantastic in game number 2 on that Yone. Game number 1 was good. He absolutely outplayed the Victor, but I mean, holy shit, like Yone into Kassadin. Yes, it's incredibly Yone favored in my opinion, right? We can talk about this all the time. Kassadin is incredibly exploitable early on in games because he has no survivability if you just want to full commit, full dive him before pre-6, right? He has no way to actually deal with that and still survive the laning phase against someone who can deal as much damage early as Yone. But if you get that lead, you can keep pressuring. You don't have to just go, oh, Kassadin hit level 6. Oh, Kassadin hit level 11, which I'm not even sure he did in this game. I mean, it was actually ridiculous. We need to stop, like, pushing on him now because he has strong Realm Warp. You can keep pressuring him. You can keep generating gold. BDD realized this, and he played super aggressive on the Yone, and he was fantastic for it. I want to see more people play like this into Kassadin. He made that pick completely and utterly useless. We'll get to Karis in a bit, but credit to Lehens as well. Really good karma game from him in game 2. He was all over the freaking map. Aiming was allowed to just kind of do his own thing in the bottom lane. They won bot lane super early in that matchup. Aiming was super far ahead. And so Lehens was just like, screw it, I'm just going to be everywhere as Karma. And he did that. He was able to help out the Yone. He was able to help out the Maokai. Camille would roam out there, and KT just dominated the whole map. I mean, every lane was completely and utterly obliterated on the side of KT. And generally speaking, they just looked phenomenal in this game. For BRION, tough loss. I mean, you looked good at the start of the season. Not to say that this is like a complete, like, momentum killer, but this is not good. Like, this was a complete shellacking. I think you could give dud of the series to basically anybody on the side of BRION in this game, or in this series. You could give it to Umti for that horrible Vi performance in game 2, where he just got jungled off the map. You could give it to Effort, who made 0 plays on Heimerdinger in either game. For me, I'm going to give it to Karis, because it felt like of all the people to get run over, Karis got run over in the most embarrassing fashion, which is picking Kassadin, getting counterpicked, and then getting destroyed, right? Like, ego picking Kassadin, you know, BDD bringing the Yone out, and then just, I mean, Karis having 0 impact on the game. So he's going to be my dud of the series. But again, you want to give it to Morgan for getting run over in the 1v1 in the top lane? Great. You want to give it to Henna? Sure, he did nothing. The Ashe did literally negative damage. I mean, everybody on BRION was done of the series. It was just bad. Bad overall from them as a team. I just think the mid lane in particular, that matchup was probably the easiest to highlight in terms of where things went wrong for BRION. So what does it mean outlook-wise for these two teams? I don't really think I can analyze these games any further, so what does it mean outlook-wise? Well, BRION still, I think, is competitive, right? This is just what KT Rolster does. I think this has more this says more about KT, in my opinion, than it does about Bro. Bro, obviously, not being able to keep up isn't particularly great, but on paper, this team really isn't all that talented. They just play really well as a unit, as a cohesive team together. When they just get outskilled, they get outskilled, and that's kind of what happened here. I still think that they can be relatively competitive, and I still think they're probably a little bit better than the bottom teams in the league, but not a great showing from them. Certainly not how you wanted to end week 3. And then for KT Rolster, this is just who they are. When they can skill check you and win, they're going to skill check you and win. But sometimes they can't do that, and they have to rely on some more sophisticated gameplay, which they just really haven't proven that they can do up until this point. If they can play like this every single game, they're going to win the LCK with no question marks. I mean, they are that ridiculous when they play like this. The problem is I don't think they're going to be allowed to play like this against the best teams in the league. I still have some major question marks about whether or not this team can compete in the upper echelon, you know, the top 3 of the teams in the league, but this should be a no-brainer playoff team if they're able to dispatch a team like Bro like this, and hopefully they're going to be able to keep up that momentum as the season keeps progressing. That's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week 3. And it was a fun one. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Dplus KIA. And DK is able to pick up the 2-1 series win. KDF looking okay in this series. Certainly not bad, but DK definitely looking like the better team, even if it was a little bit spicy there for a bit. Honestly, reminds me of the T1 series the day before this a lot. When it comes to these teams' abilities to kind of close out teams that they should be able to beat. You know, DK here with KDF, of course, T1 with Nongshim, I actually think very, very similar. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's the win that matters, and that's what DK was able to pull out. I actually think their team played relatively well, but they are starting to show their cracks. This is not the same team that was kind of clicking on all cylinders in week 1 and week 2. They are starting to show a few of their problems. I still think a lot of the players that were performing well in week 1 and week 2 are still kind of carrying the load for DK. Most notably, in my opinion, the bot lane, which continues to be major for DK just in general. Deft and Kellen have fantastic synergy together, and I know a lot of people are saying like, oh, looks like Deft is still in, you know, best in the world form. I didn't see this last year out of Deft. Deft was a very good player on DRX, and he had a very good World Championship tournament. But in the regular season, I don't think anybody was really considering him best AD carry in the world or in that conversation. He was incredibly stable, but he wasn't someone that was like actively pushing his team incredibly forward. He was just someone who was making his team better. That is not DK this year. He's been given a ton of resources on very aggressive picks, things like the Draven, things like the Caitlyn, and he's making use of it. This is not the late game hyper-scaling carries that he was playing last year. Pretty much the entirety of summer 2022, Deft, in my opinion, looks better this year than he did last year on DRX, and for me, he's going to get my player of the series. I know some people are going to want to give it to Showmaker. He had a really good game 3 on the Akali, but for me, that Caitlyn was way more influential, especially because of that gank early on in the game that Canyon was able to execute, where June just died basically for no reason. Deft was able to kind of snowball the game out of control from that point. The Caitlyn was able to just completely outpace the Jhin, whose entire purpose is to stop Caitlyn in the early game, and so Deft really made that work for me in game number 3, so he's going to get player of the series. Obviously, you got to give a big shout out to Kellen here, who just continues to play with Deft incredibly well. I think Kellen is proving to everybody that he deserves to be considered one of the best supports in the world. I know a lot of people were really hesitant to put him in that conversation, but he has been stellar over the start of this season. Him and Deft have a phenomenal chemistry. Their lane 2v2 is honestly spectacular, and there's a chance that it only gets better. That's kind of what's happened with Kellen in basically every situation that he's gone to, is he's made his bot lane look incredibly strong, and that is no difference here with Deft on DK. I want to give a big shout out to Canyon as well. Really good series from him. I think the Maokai game in game 1 was incredibly impressive. Youngjae had absolutely no shot of being able to play against him in that game, so credit to Canyon, but big shocker, Canyon's better than Youngjae. Not a big surprise. My one criticism here for DK is going to be Kana up in the top lane. I was actually very complimentary of Kana over the first couple of weeks of games. It felt like he settled into DK fantastically, better than someone like Bertle, or even Nuguri last year was kind of settling. It felt like Kana was really kind of clicking with Canyon on a different wavelength, but that kind of fell apart here in week 3. I don't think he was particularly good in their series against Gen.G, and I don't think he was particularly good in the series against KDF either. I think Dudu honestly played better than him. Kana maybe is just going to be a little bit more inconsistent. You know, obviously coming off of a very inconsistent year on Nongshim last year, maybe we just have to expect that he might not mesh with the rest of the team as well as we would have hoped through the first couple of weeks. I still think he's going to be positive for this team overall, and certainly better than kind of the rotating carousel that they had last year at that position, but I don't know if he's going to be a superstar like I think he was starting to show through the first couple of weeks. He might not be a top 2 top laner in the region. I think we might have to settle for top 3, top 4, which I think is still fine for DK. It's just something worth noting. For KDF, though, I think you had some good moments in this series. Again, I think Dudu is worth pointing out here in the top lane. He was someone who I really hadn't talked about all that much for KDF up until this point. When they lose, he really is not the problem, and they haven't really won a lot. When they won, it was Bulldog and it's Youngjae and, you know, these more flashy young players kind of showing their potential off. In this series, it was Dudu. It was kind of that Hanwha Live Esports 2022 Dudu that was willing to go, okay, well, I'll play a tank, but I'm going to play him so aggressively, I'm going to dominate in the 1v1, and I'm going to try to be able to translate that lead into the rest of the map so my team has an easier time of being able to fight later in games. That's what he did a lot last year, and it really helped that HLE team out a lot, and he did it again here for KDF in game number 2. In my opinion, he was easily the biggest reason they were able to win that game, but we have to talk about the rest of the series. I think the bot lane was kind of meh. June in particular just did not look good in that support position, consistently being caught out. I know a lot of people are going to complain about the Jhin pick, but I do understand it from a mentality standpoint. And honestly, Taiyun played it really well in game number 2 in particular. I actually thought he was incredibly useful. Jhin Ashe is just so oppressive to play into that they were actually able to look really, really solid in game number 2. But June in game number 3 was really bad in my opinion. And then done of the series for me is going to go to Bulldog in the mid lane. Now, I praised Bulldog earlier in the week. I think his talent is absolutely there. The mechanics are clearly there. He has very much impressed me with his ability to play 1v1 in mid lane against a lot of the top mid laners in the region. However, I think the macro game is still pretty far away for KDF and for Bulldog in particular. This was kind of the Chovy syndrome, as people like to call it, early Chovy, where it's like Showmakers roaming around the map on Akali and on Jace and on LeBlanc and making plays and really being influential and creating numbers advantages and roaming with his jungler, and Bulldog his mid lane farming, and he's still mid lane farming, and he's still mid lane farming. Like, I understand that's a problem that you can grow into. That's what happened with Chovy. Incredibly mechanically talented player that just needed to learn how to adapt to the rest of the team, and he did so, and Bulldog obviously can do so. This game was a good example that Bulldog isn't exactly there yet. Still a very talented player in the 1v1s, but wasn't particularly good in team fights and certainly didn't make the best macro decisions, especially in game number 3 on that Swain. So Bulldog is going to get my dud of the series. But overall, KDF looking okay. You know, you're not going into the series expecting to win. If you're KDF, you just want to put up a good fight. And being able to take a game, honestly, is a good fight. I think it's everything you wanted to see out of KDF this week. They're not exactly a team that I think can really contend for like top 6 or anything like that. I already talked about how I think the bottom 3 in the league right now of KDF, DRX, and Nongshim are all kind of clumped together. But, you know, it's good to see them at least kind of show up and play relatively well, even if I don't think it was necessarily on them. And then for DK, they just continue to win in the same ways that they were winning earlier. Deft and Kellen, they are going to be the big focal point, it seems like, for this team early in games and early in the season. And I think that's the right call. If these two are going to be able to carry like they are right now, invest into them. Showmaker's been meh in the mid lane, so I understand moving away from him. Canyon can play whatever. It doesn't even matter. And Kana's a little volatile in the top. He can win the 1v1s, and when he does that, this team is basically unbeatable. But Deft and Kellen are really on a different level right now, and if DK can continue to play like this, I know they lost to Gen.G earlier in the week, but the top 3 are all really strong in the LCK. DK is still very much a world-class team, and I think they're going to prove that as the season continues onward. All right, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 3 overview and analysis. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings after Week 3 from 1 to 10. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power ranking numbers. In the second column, you're going to see how that has changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the risers and the fallers. Not many changes this week. I don't really feel like the upsets really proved a lot to me. I really need to see more consistency out of basically everyone in the league, and I'm honestly taking more of a wait-and-see approach when it comes to my LCK power rankings, and I'll kind of explain that. One of the big jumps, Gen.G obviously jumping above DK. I have Gen.G moving up to number 2, DK falling to 3. Gen.G just beat them, and they looked good doing it. I think Gen.G really have looked fantastic ever since losing to T1 in their first series of the year. They basically looked unbeatable, and I think they've, at this point, deserved to be put at number 2 over DK, who have shown at least a few cracks in the armor. I also have Liiv, SANDBOX, and Hanwha jumping above KT Rolster. Some people are going to be really mad about that. KT falling to 6. I want to say this, and I want to make this abundantly clear. 4, 5, and 6, put them in whatever order you want. I said this a lot last year with kind of that cluster of teams in this department where it was like Liiv, SANDBOX, KT Rolster, DRX. They were all relatively similar in terms of, you know, talent, and I really couldn't separate them. It's the same thing this year. SANDBOX, KT, Hanwha, they all can beat the others, and I wouldn't be surprised even at all. If you want to put KT at 4 and SANDBOX at 6 because SANDBOX has the least amount of talent on paper, fine. If you want to put SANDBOX at 4 and KT at 6 because SANDBOX has been the most consistent and KT's been the least consistent, fine. Hanwha had a good leak, so I wanted to bump them up to number 5. KT lost to KDF, so I bumped them down to number 6. That's really all this is. It really is not a big difference, and so I wouldn't sit there and be like, oh, how is KT 6 and not 4? They effectively are all number 4, or they're all number 6. Like, they really are all in that same vicinity. Bro stays at 7, the bottom 3 stay in their same order because I don't think any of them have really separated themselves at all. Really, I just think they're all kind of meh teams. Maybe one is better than the other. Maybe I'm not giving KDF enough credit. Maybe DRX should be 10, but for now, I just don't think it really matters to switch them around too much. They feel like they're probably in around the right spots here, and so moving on to my player of the week and my dud of the week. This is where it gets spicy. My player of the week in week 3 is actually going to go to Klid on Hanwha. My dud of the week in week 1 becomes my player of the week in week 3. He was actually really influential in both of Hanwha's wins this week. His early games were so much better on a champion like Elise, and he did a great job of transitioning those leads into late game pressures. Of course, being able to smite some things away from a player like Krako is absolutely huge. He was the biggest reason Hanwha went 2-0 this week for the first time this season. So Klid, absolutely, in my opinion, deserving player of the week. And my dud of the week should be no surprise to anybody who watched the video. It is going to go to Beryl on DRX, who was just atrocious this week. There really is no explanation for why he was as bad as he was, other than this is just what Beryl does. Sometimes he has bad weeks. This was absolutely one of them. I don't really think that there was a lot of competition for this. Beryl was a pretty easy choice for dud of the week. Klid was a pretty easy choice for player of the week. But that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Who am I too high on? Who am I too low on? Who was your player of the week? Who was your dud of the week? I'd love to hear you guys' comments and feedback down in the comment section. Of course, if you liked the video, if you made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to the channel. Of course, if you're new, I post videos and weekly recaps for all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL. So hit that subscribe button. It really does help out the channel a ton. And I hope you guys are really enjoying the videos that we've been putting out this year in spring. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.